Ephraim Kolstad's cabin glowed warm in -20-degree cold, while his neighbors burned through their winter firewood in desperation. The hay fortress they had mocked 3 months earlier was now the only thing standing between his family and the same fate that had already claimed one man's life. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable frontier innovation. The winter of 1856 found Ephraim Kolstad exactly where he wanted to be. His cabin stood on a gentle rise in the Dakota Territory, 3 miles south of the small settlement that had taken root along the creek bottom. The structure was solid, built the previous spring with logs he had cut and hauled himself over the course of 2 months. 18 feet by 24 feet, with a stone fireplace he had constructed using rocks pulled from the creek bed and mortared with clay he had mixed according to specifications an older settler had shared. The cabin had a proper door, hung on iron hinges he had purchased in St. Paul, 2 windows with actual glass panes, and a roof that didn't leak even during the heaviest rains. By the standards of the territory in 1856, Ephraim had built well. He was 32 years old, originally from a Norwegian settlement in Wisconsin, and he had come to Dakota with his wife Ingrid and their daughter Astrid 2 years earlier. Their son Lars had been born the previous spring, delivered with the help of 2 neighbor women in the cabin that Ephraim had built specifically to house his growing family. He had proved up his land claim, cleared 15 acres for planting, and harvested a decent crop of wheat and corn that first season. The winter ahead looked manageable. He had cut and stacked 4 cords of firewood, enough to keep the fireplace burning from November through March. His root cellar held potatoes, turnips, carrots, and squash. Smoked venison hung from the rafters. Sacks of cornmeal and flour sat against the wall. By every measure, Ephraim was a competent homesteader. The settlement around him consisted of 19 families, most of them Scandinavian or German immigrants who had come west looking for land and opportunity. His nearest neighbor, Matthias Brenner, lived half a mile to the east. The Brenner cabin was visible from Ephraim's front door on clear days, a thin line of smoke rising from their chimney marking their location. Beyond Matthias lived the Lindgren family, then the Reinhardts, then the Pritchards, spreading out along the creek in a loose chain of homesteads connected by wagon paths and mutual dependence. Ephraim knew these families. He had helped Matthias raise his barn the previous summer. He had traded labor with Otto Lindgren during harvest. He attended the monthly gatherings at the Reinhardt cabin where the men discussed crops and weather, and the women shared food and conversation. His daughter Astrid played with the other settlement children when families gathered. This was community in its simplest form, people helping each other survive in country that was beautiful and productive, but also unforgiving to those who made mistakes. That November, as the first serious cold settled over the territory, Ephraim felt confident. His family was warm, fed, and secure. The cabin he had built would protect them through the winter ahead. Everything was in place. He had done everything right. But confidence, Ephraim would learn, was not the same as understanding. The first serious cold arrived in mid-November. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees above zero and stayed there for 5 days. Ephraim kept the fireplace burning constantly, feeding it logs every few hours through the day and night. The fire crackled and threw heat into the cabin, but the warmth never quite reached the corners. Astrid complained that her feet were cold even though she sat only 6 feet from the flames. Ingrid wrapped Lars in extra blankets and kept him close to the fire. At night, despite the banked coals glowing orange in the fireplace, frost formed on the inside of the windows. Ephraim noticed details he had ignored during the milder autumn months. Cold air seeped through gaps between the logs, despite the moss and clay chinking he had packed carefully during construction. He could feel drafts moving across the floor, currents of frigid air finding their way inside, no matter how well he thought he had sealed the walls. The door fit snugly in its frame, but cold radiated through the wood itself, as if the planks offered no resistance to the temperature outside. The glass windows, which had seemed like such a luxury when he installed them, transferred cold directly into the room. He could hold his hand near the glass and feel the chill without touching the surface. He started paying attention to his firewood consumption. 4 cords had seemed generous when he calculated his winter needs back in September. But after that first 5-day cold spell, he realized he had burned through nearly a quarter cord. The mathematics were troubling. If he maintained this consumption rate through a normal Dakota winter, which typically ran from November through March, 5 months of cold, he would need 6 or 7 cords minimum. He had 4. Ephraim began rationing. He let the fire burn lower at night, banking it carefully but not feeding it as frequently. The cabin temperature dropped noticeably. Ingrid started keeping Lars in bed with them for warmth. Astrid slept in her clothes under 2 blankets. During the day, the family stayed within a tight radius of the fireplace, venturing to the cold edges of the cabin only when necessary. This was not how Ephraim had imagined winter in the cabin he had built. He talked to Matthias during a brief warm spell in late November when the temperature climbed to 25 degrees and both men emerged to split more firewood. Matthias was experiencing the same problems. His cabin, built the same year using the same techniques, bled heat just as badly. They discussed chinking methods and door seals, but Matthias had no better solutions. Every settler they knew faced identical challenges. Some cabins were slightly warmer than others based on construction quality, but the fundamental problem was universal. Log cabins in Dakota winters were barely adequate shelters. They kept out wind and precipitation, but they could not hold heat. Ephraim returned to his own cabin and stared at the walls he had built with such care, understanding for the first time that adequate construction was not the same as effective protection. The cold spell in early December brought temperatures down to 5 below zero. It lasted 3 days and 2 nights. During that time, Ephraim burned through wood at a frightening rate, keeping the fire roaring just to maintain a temperature inside that allowed his family to function. Even so, water in the bucket near the door developed a skin of ice. Bread left on the table overnight froze solid. Ingrid boiled water constantly, as much for the steam and warmth it produced as for cooking or cleaning. The cabin felt less like shelter and more like a marginally improved version of being outside. On the morning of December 8th, Matthias arrived at Ephraim's door before sunrise. His face was grim. Silas Hartwick was dead. The elderly man, who lived alone in a cabin 2 miles south, had not appeared at the Sunday gathering the previous day. Matthias and Gustav Reinhardt had ridden out to check on him that morning and found him in his bed, frozen. The fire in his fireplace had burned down to ashes. Wood remained stacked against the wall. Silas had apparently gone to sleep and simply never woken up. The funeral was held 2 days later when the ground thawed enough to dig. 19 families gathered at the small cemetery plot on the hill above the creek. Silas had been 71 years old, a widower who had come to Dakota to live near his son's family before his son died of fever the previous summer. He had stayed on alone, insisting he could manage 1 more winter. Dr. Pierce, who had examined the body, said it was exposure and hypothermia. The cold had simply overwhelmed him during sleep. His heart had stopped. It was, the doctor said, not an uncommon way for elderly people to die during harsh winters on the frontier. Ephraim stood at the graveside holding Astrid's hand while the pastor from the settlement spoke words about eternal rest and God's mercy. He watched Dorothea Pritchard, Silas's neighbor, weeping openly. She had brought Silas food twice a week and had checked on him regularly. She was telling anyone who would listen that Silas had seemed fine just 3 days before he died. He had been eating well. He had not been sick. He had firewood. He had supplies. He should have survived the winter easily. Ephraim understood what had killed Silas. It was not lack of firewood or food or preparation. It was the cabin itself. A log structure that could not hold heat. An old man alone, unable to wake every few hours to feed the fire. The temperature inside dropping degree by degree through the night until it reached a point where the human body could not maintain its core warmth. Silas had frozen to death inside shelter he had believed was adequate. That night, Ephraim lay awake, listening to the wind outside and the fire crackling in his fireplace. He thought about Silas. He thought about his own children sleeping in the cold corners of the cabin. He thought about the winter stretching ahead for 3 more months. And he realized something had to change. Sleep became difficult for Ephraim after Silas's funeral. He would lie in bed at night listening to the sounds of the cabin. Wind found every gap and crack, whistling softly through spaces he could not see in daylight. The fire popped and settled, each sound marking wood being consumed, the pile outside shrinking. He started doing calculations in his head. 4 cords of wood, approximately 500 logs, 5 months of winter, 100 days. 5 logs per day if he rationed carefully. But 5 logs did not produce enough heat to keep the cabin comfortable. 7 or 8 logs maintained barely adequate warmth. The mathematics led to an inescapable conclusion. He would run out of firewood before winter ended. He began studying his cabin with new attention. During the day, when sunlight made details visible, he examined every aspect of the construction. The logs were 8 to 10 inches in diameter, stacked horizontally with saddle notches at the corners. He had selected reasonably straight trees and fitted them as carefully as he knew how. The chinking between logs was moss and clay, packed into the gaps and smoothed on both interior and exterior surfaces. It looked adequate, but when he held his hand near the chinking, he felt air moving. The clay had dried and cracked in places. The moss had compressed and left gaps. Cold air poured through these openings. He examined the corners where logs joined. The notches created solid connections, but they also created spaces where logs did not touch completely. These gaps, even filled with chinking, were weak points. Heat escaped through them. Cold entered. The door was solid wood, 3 inches thick, fitted carefully into its frame. But wood itself conducted cold. He could feel temperature transferring through the planks. The windows were worse. Glass transferred cold even more efficiently than wood. The beautiful windows he had been so proud of were essentially holes in his walls from a thermal perspective. Ephraim started watching how heat moved in the cabin. He noticed that warmth from the fireplace rose directly to the ceiling and spread across the peaked roof before finding its way out through gaps in the construction. The floor remained cold because dense cold air settled and stayed there. The walls were slightly warmer than outside temperature, but not much. He began to understand that his cabin was not a container that held heat. It was more like a sieve. Heat poured in from the fireplace and immediately began escaping through every surface. He talked to other men in the settlement, asking how they managed winter heating. Everyone had the same answer: burn more wood, cut deeper into reserves. Except that winter meant being cold unless you were sitting directly beside the fire. This was simply how frontier life worked. Ephraim found this answer unsatisfying. There had to be a better method. Burning more wood addressed the symptom, but not the problem. The problem was that cabins could not hold heat. He thought about Silas Hartwick alone in his cabin, the fire burning down, the cold creeping in. He thought about his own family, Astrid shivering at night, Lars wrapped in blankets even during the day. He thought about Ingrid's worried face when she looked at the dwindling woodpile. Something fundamental needed to change. Not in how much heat they produced, but in how well the cabin retained whatever heat the fire generated. Ephraim began paying attention to things he had previously ignored. During a brief warm spell in mid-December, he walked through the woods behind his cabin, studying animal preparations for winter. He found a fox den dug into a hillside, the entrance narrow but the interior chamber lined with dried grass and leaves. The insulation was visible even from outside, layers of plant material creating a buffer between the den and the frozen ground. He discovered a bird nest abandoned after the fall migration, constructed with remarkable precision from grass stems and small twigs, the interior cup lined with soft plant down. The structure was lightweight but dense, designed to trap air and hold warmth. He remembered stories from his childhood in Wisconsin, tales his grandmother had told about the old country. Norwegian farmhouses in the mountain valleys, she had said, were sometimes built with double walls. The space between walls was filled with sawdust or straw, materials that kept the fierce mountain cold from penetrating the living spaces. He had dismissed these stories as exaggeration or misremembering, but now he wondered if there was practical knowledge embedded in those tales. He began experimenting with materials. He stuffed dried grass between two boards and left them outside overnight during a cold snap. In the morning, he brought them inside and noted how the board with grass insulation warmed faster than bare wood. He tried the same experiment with moss, with bark strips, with dried corn stalks. The grass performed best, warming quickly and retaining heat longer than other materials. He examined the grass stems under close inspection, noting their hollow, tubular structure. Each stem was essentially a tiny, air-filled chamber. Bundled together, thousands of these chambers created a matrix that trapped air and resisted heat transfer. Hay was essentially dried grass. After harvest, every farmer in the settlement had hay stored for winter livestock feed. Hay was abundant, cheap, and available. It was also hollow-stemmed, lightweight, and easy to handle. Ephraim started considering hay not as animal feed, but as building material. The idea seemed absurd at first. Hay was food, not construction material. But the physics made sense. If hollow grass stems insulated bird nests and fox dens effectively, and if Norwegian farmers used straw between walls, then hay should work as insulation for a cabin. The question was how to apply it. He could not rebuild his cabin with double walls. The structure was already complete, and he had neither time nor resources for major reconstruction during winter. But he could potentially add insulation to the exterior. If he built some kind of framework around the existing cabin and filled that framework with hay, he would create an insulated envelope around the living space. Heat generated inside would be trapped by the hay barrier instead of escaping through the log walls. The more Ephraim thought about this approach, the more logical it seemed. The cabin would look strange, buried in hay like some kind of oversized animal den. People would think he was insane. But if it worked, if it actually retained heat and reduced firewood consumption, the appearance would not matter. His family would be warm. That was the only consideration that counted. Spring arrived in late March 1857, bringing relief from the brutal winter that had tested every family in the settlement. Ephraim had survived by burning through his entire firewood supply and then cutting additional wood during brief warm spells in February and March. His family had remained healthy, but barely. There had been nights when the cabin temperature dropped low enough that everyone wore coats indoors. Ingrid had stopped mentioning the cold after January, simply accepting it as unchangeable reality. But Ephraim had not accepted it. Throughout the winter, he had continued thinking about insulation and hay and how to build a barrier that would trap heat. As soon as the ground thawed enough to work, he began sketching plans. The concept was straightforward in principle, but complex in execution. He needed to build a framework around his cabin that would hold hay bales in place while maintaining stability through wind and weather. The framework had to stand far enough from the cabin walls to allow adequate hay thickness, but close enough that the structure remained manageable in size. He decided on 3 feet of distance. That would allow for hay bales stacked horizontally, providing approximately 30 inches of insulation around the entire cabin. He drew diagrams on pieces of paper salvaged from old newspapers, calculating dimensions and materials needed. A fence structure seemed most practical. Vertical posts driven into the ground, horizontal rails connecting them, creating a framework that would support the weight of stacked hay bales. He would need posts every 6 feet around the perimeter, rails at 3 heights, bottom, middle, and top, to prevent hay from bulging outward. The structure would essentially be a large fence built in a rectangle around his cabin. Ingrid watched him sketching and calculating during evening hours after the children were asleep. She asked what he was planning. Ephraim explained the concept, describing how hay would insulate the cabin and trap heat during the next winter. Ingrid listened without interrupting, then asked the practical question. Where would the hay come from? They needed their hay for the cow and the 2 pigs they kept. Buying additional hay would be expensive. Ephraim had already considered this problem. He would grow extra hay on a portion of the land he had cleared, but not yet planted with crops. 2 acres dedicated to hay would produce enough volume for the insulation project while still leaving adequate feed for livestock. It would mean less land for wheat and corn, reduced cash crop income, but the trade seemed worthwhile. He could also trade labor for hay with neighbors who had surplus. The Lindgren family typically grew more hay than their livestock required. He shared his plan with Matthias Brenner one afternoon in April while they were repairing fence line between their properties. Matthias listened to the explanation, asked several questions about construction details, then said what Ephraim expected him to say. It seemed like an enormous amount of work for uncertain benefit. Hay was meant for feeding animals, not wrapping around cabins. What would happen if the hay got wet? Would it not rot and attract vermin? Ephraim had answers for these concerns, but he could see Matthias was skeptical. That was acceptable. Ephraim was not trying to convince anyone else to follow his approach. He simply needed to build something that would keep his own family warm when winter returned. Construction began in late May after spring planting was completed. Ephraim started by marking the perimeter where posts would be installed, measuring 3 feet out from each cabin wall and using stakes and string to create straight lines. The rectangle measured 24 feet by 30 feet, enclosing the cabin with adequate clearance. He needed 20 posts total, 6 along each long side and 4 along each short side, spaced approximately 6 feet apart. Digging post holes was backbreaking work. The prairie soil was dense and filled with roots from the native grasses that had grown there for centuries. Ephraim dug each hole 2 feet deep, wide enough to accommodate posts that were 6 inches in diameter. He selected young oak trees from the creek bottom timber for posts, cutting them to 8-foot lengths that would extend 6 feet above ground after installation. Each post was stripped of bark and the bottom end sharpened to ease driving into the holes. He tamped soil firmly around each post after installation, ensuring stability that would resist wind pressure when hay bales were stacked against the framework. The horizontal rails connecting the posts were split from larger logs, creating planks approximately 4 inches wide and 2 inches thick. He installed 3 rails at different heights on each side of the framework. The bottom rail sat 1 foot above ground level. The middle rail was positioned 4 feet up. The top rail crossed at 7 feet, just below the cabin's roofline. Each rail was notched into the posts and secured with wooden pegs, creating a rigid structure that would not shift or sag under the weight of hay. Neighbors noticed the construction. Matthias stopped by several times to observe progress and ask questions. Gustav Reinhardt rode past one afternoon, paused to stare at the emerging framework, then continued without comment. Otto Lindgren visited and asked directly what Ephraim was building. Ephraim explained the hay insulation concept. Otto nodded slowly, clearly thinking Ephraim was wasting time and materials, but too polite to say so directly. The most vocal response came from Gustav during a Sunday gathering in June. The settlement families had congregated at the Reinhardt cabin for the monthly social event. After the meal, while men stood outside talking and women cleaned dishes inside, Gustav mentioned Ephraim's project. He did not address Ephraim directly, but spoke loudly enough that everyone could hear. "Looks like Kolstad is building a barn around his house. Maybe he plans to keep livestock in there with his family." Several men laughed. Ephraim said nothing, simply continued his conversation with Matthias about crop conditions. By early July, the framework was complete. 4 walls of posts and rails encircling the cabin, sturdy enough to support significant weight, positioned precisely to allow 3 feet of space for hay insulation. The structure looked strange and purposeless without the hay in place, a fence that enclosed nothing and served no obvious function. Ephraim ignored the appearance and the comments. He had built the foundation for something that would make sense only when completed. The framework was ready. Now he needed hay, and that would come after harvest in the fall when dried grass was available in sufficient quantities to fill the space he had created. Harvest came in late September 1857. Ephraim cut hay from the 2 acres he had dedicated to the project, working through warm autumn days with a scythe, cutting the tall prairie grass and leaving it in windrows to dry. The weather cooperated. 3 weeks of clear skies that allowed the hay to cure properly without rain damage. He raked the dried hay into piles and used a borrowed hay fork to load it onto his wagon. Each load was compressed and tied, creating bundles that weighed approximately 80 pounds each and measured roughly 3 feet by 2 feet by 18 inches. He also traded labor with Otto Lindgren, spending 4 days helping Otto repair his barn roof in exchange for 20 hay bales from Otto's surplus. The additional hay gave Ephraim enough volume to begin the insulation project. He calculated he needed approximately 120 bales to completely encircle the cabin from ground level to the roof line. He had produced 90 bales from his own acres and acquired 20 from Otto. 10 more bales came from a trade with the Thatcher family. He was ready. The installation process was straightforward but physically demanding. Ephraim started on the north wall, the side that received the harshest winter winds. He stacked hay bales horizontally between the fence framework and the cabin wall, fitting them tightly together and building upward in courses like bricklaying. The first course sat on the ground, creating a continuous barrier. The second course stacked directly on top, offset slightly so the joints did not align. Each course added approximately 18 inches of height. By the time he reached the 7th course, the hay wall stood level with the cabin's eave line. The work took 2 full weeks. Each bale had to be lifted and positioned carefully, pressed firmly against adjacent bales to eliminate gaps. The corners required special attention, with bales cut and shaped to fit properly around the framework posts. Ephraim left only one opening, a narrow gap on the south wall where the door was located. This opening was 3 feet wide, enough for passage in and out. He would close it with a hay-filled frame during the coldest months. By mid-October, the transformation was complete. The cabin had disappeared behind a fortress of golden hay. The structure stood 8 feet tall at the walls, the hay rising nearly to the roof peak. Only the stone chimney protruded above the hay barrier, and the roof itself remained visible from above. From ground level, approaching the cabin meant walking toward what appeared to be a massive haystack with a door cut into one side. The visual impact was striking and absurd. Ephraim's cabin looked like no other structure in the settlement or anywhere else in the territory. It was a hay fortress, a dwelling buried in livestock feed, an architectural oddity that defied every convention of frontier construction. Neighbors came to stare. Children pointed and giggled. The mockery Ephraim had anticipated began immediately, and it was more intense than he had expected. Gustav Reinhardt arrived 3 days after the hay installation was complete. He rode up to the opening Ephraim had left for the door, dismounted, and walked slowly around the entire perimeter of the hay fortress without speaking. Ephraim was inside splitting kindling when he heard Gustav's voice calling from outside. He emerged to find Gustav standing with his arms crossed, staring at the hay walls with an expression of disbelief. "What in God's name have you built here, Kolstad?" Gustav's tone was not curious, it was accusatory, as if Ephraim had committed some violation of community standards. Ephraim explained calmly that he had insulated his cabin with hay to reduce heat loss during winter. Gustav shook his head slowly. "You have wasted good hay, money, and 3 months of labor on this foolishness. That hay could have fed livestock through 2 winters. Instead, you have built a fire hazard and made yourself the joke of the territory." The comment about fire had not occurred to Ephraim. He had considered moisture and rot, but not fire risk. He explained that the hay was dry and packed tightly, with no air circulation to support combustion, and that his chimney extended well above the hay line with clearance around it. Gustav was not interested in explanations. He mounted his horse and rode away, shaking his head in what appeared to be genuine disappointment that a competent man like Ephraim would engage in such stupidity. The Sunday gathering in late October was worse. 20 families assembled at the Reinhardt cabin for the monthly social event. Ephraim attended with Ingrid and the children, knowing his hay fortress would be discussed, but hoping for civil conversation. Instead, it became the primary topic. During the meal, several men made jokes loud enough for everyone to hear. Matthias mentioned that Kolstad had built the most expensive livestock shelter in Dakota Territory, but forgot to put animals in it. Otto suggested that maybe Ephraim planned to hibernate like a bear, sleeping through winter in his hay cave. Even men who normally did not participate in mockery joined the laughter. Gustav stood during the gathering and addressed the group directly. He said that while he respected every man's right to manage his own property as he saw fit, he felt obligated to point out that Ephraim's hay fortress represented dangerous thinking. Resources were precious on the frontier. Wasting hay on unproven construction theories was irresponsible, especially when families depended on every resource for survival. Others nodded in agreement. Ingrid sat quietly through the comments, her face composed but tense. Astrid asked her mother in a whisper why people were laughing at their house. Ingrid told her to eat her food and not worry about adult conversations. After the gathering ended, Family's November brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees above zero and held there for a week. Ephraim watched his neighbors' chimneys produce thick columns of smoke as families burned wood aggressively to maintain heat. His own approach was different. He lit a modest fire in his fireplace, using half the wood he had burned during similar cold the previous year, and waited to see what would happen. The results were immediate and remarkable. Heat from the fireplace filled the cabin and stayed there. Within 2 hours of lighting the fire, the interior temperature had climbed to a level that felt genuinely comfortable. Ephraim could stand in the corners of the cabin, areas that had been frigid the previous winter, and feel warmth. The walls were no longer cold to the touch. The floor retained heat instead of remaining frozen. Most significantly, the temperature held steady. Previous winters had required constant fire feeding to maintain minimal warmth. Now, a single fire burned slowly through the morning and kept the cabin comfortable until evening. Ingrid noticed the difference before Ephraim mentioned it. She was cooking at the table in the corner, an activity that had been miserable the previous winter because the corner was always cold. Now she worked without her shawl, wearing only her regular dress. She looked at Ephraim with an expression that combined surprise and relief. "It is actually warm in here." Ephraim nodded. The hay was working exactly as he had calculated it would. He began documenting the results with careful attention. Each evening, he recorded the exterior temperature by checking the thermometer he had mounted outside the door. He noted how many logs he burned each day and estimated the interior temperature based on comfort level and ice formation in the water bucket. The data confirmed what he felt. Exterior temperature 15 degrees. Interior temperature approximately 60 degrees. Differential of 45 degrees maintained with 4 logs per day. Previous winter under similar conditions had required 8 logs per day to maintain an interior temperature of perhaps 40 degrees. The children adapted to the warmth with obvious pleasure. Astrid played on the floor without needing extra clothing. Lars crawled freely instead of being confined to blankets near the fire. Ingrid moved through the cabin performing daily tasks without the constant shivering that had marked the previous winter. The family was warm, genuinely warm, for the first time since arriving in Dakota territory. Ephraim said nothing to his neighbors about the results. He continued his normal routines, cutting firewood when needed, but at a much reduced pace, checking on livestock, maintaining equipment. Matthias visited in mid-November and stepped inside the cabin to discuss spring planting plans. Matthias removed his heavy coat within moments, commenting that Ephraim must have a large fire going. Ephraim gestured toward the fireplace, where a modest blaze burned. Matthias stared at the fire, then at Ephraim, clearly trying to understand how such a small fire could produce such warmth. Ephraim explained simply that the hay insulation was holding heat inside instead of letting it escape. Matthias said nothing, but his expression showed he was reconsidering his earlier skepticism. December brought a sustained storm that tested every structure in the settlement. Snow fell for 3 days, accumulating 2 feet on the ground. Behind the snow came Arctic air that pushed temperatures down to 5 below zero. The cold held for 6 days without relief. It was the kind of weather that killed livestock, froze water lines, and made simply surviving a daily challenge. Ephraim's neighbors responded the way they always did. Chimneys poured smoke from dawn until late night as families burned through their carefully accumulated firewood reserves at frightening rates. Men ventured outside only when absolutely necessary, running from house to barn to complete essential livestock care before retreating back to the marginal warmth of their cabins. Children stayed indoors, huddled near fireplaces, wearing coats and blankets even inside. Women worked in conditions that made cooking and cleaning nearly impossible as water froze and cold penetrated every corner. Inside Ephraim's hay fortress, conditions were remarkably different. He maintained a fire during the day, burning 5 or 6 logs to keep the interior comfortable. At night, he banked the coals and let the fire burn down to embers. The hay insulation held enough residual heat that the cabin remained tolerable even with minimal fire. Morning temperatures inside were cool but not frigid. Water in the bucket near the door remained liquid. Frost did not form on the windows. The family slept under normal blankets without needing the extra layers that had been essential the previous winter. The most striking difference was in the living patterns. Astrid played throughout the cabin instead of being confined to the area immediately around the fireplace. Ingrid cooked and worked at the table without wearing extra clothing. Lars crawled freely across the floor, which remained warm enough that his hands did not turn red from cold. The family occupied the entire cabin space as living area, not just the small warm zone near the fire. Ephraim calculated his wood consumption carefully during the 6-day cold spell. He had burned 32 logs total, an average of just over 5 logs per day. The previous winter, during a similar cold period, he had burned nearly 60 logs across 6 days and still maintained only marginal warmth. The efficiency gain was substantial. At his current consumption rate, his 4 cords of firewood would last through the entire winter with reserves remaining. Previous winter, he had run out of wood in late February and been forced to cut more in desperate conditions. On the 7th day, the temperature moderated to 10 above zero and the sky cleared. Matthias arrived at midday, ostensibly to check if Ephraim needed assistance after the storm, but Ephraim understood the real reason for the visit. Matthias wanted to see how the hay fortress had performed. They stood outside in the cold, discussing the storm and its impact. Then Matthias asked directly if he could see inside the cabin. Ephraim opened the door and invited him in. Matthias stepped through the doorway and stopped immediately. The temperature difference was so pronounced that he physically reacted, pulling back slightly as warmth enveloped him. He stood just inside the threshold for a long moment, letting his body adjust from the 10-degree exterior cold to the 60-degree interior warmth. Then he walked slowly into the center of the cabin, looking around as if seeing the space for the first time. "It is warm in here." Matthias spoke the words with undisguised amazement. Not just tolerable, actually warm. Ephraim nodded but did not elaborate. He gestured toward the fireplace where a modest fire burned, perhaps a third the size of what would have been necessary the previous winter to maintain even minimal comfort. Matthias examined the fire, then turned to study the walls and corners. He walked to the far corner of the cabin, the area that should have been frigidest, and held his hand near the wall. He looked at Ephraim with an expression that combined surprise and something approaching embarrassment. How is this possible? Matthias was not being rhetorical. He genuinely wanted to understand the mechanism, Ephraim explained in simple terms. The hay creates a barrier between the cold air outside and the cabin walls. Each straw in the hay is hollow, filled with air. Thousands of hollow straws create thousands of tiny air pockets. Air is a poor conductor of heat. When you trap air in small spaces, it cannot circulate, and heat cannot transfer through it effectively. The hay wall is essentially a 3-foot-thick layer of trapped air surrounding the entire cabin. Matthias considered this explanation carefully. He asked about moisture and rot. Ephraim said the hay was staying dry because cold air holds little moisture, and the cabin's interior warmth never reached the hay itself. The temperature gradient meant the hay remained at roughly the same temperature as the outside air, cold and dry. Matthias asked about fire risk. Ephraim showed him the chimney clearance and explained that tightly packed hay without air circulation did not support combustion the way loose hay might. They discussed wood consumption. Ephraim shared his calculations showing he was using less than half the firewood he had required the previous winter while maintaining far superior warmth. Matthias absorbed this information quietly, occasionally glancing at the walls as if trying to see through them to the hay beyond. Finally, he asked the question that mattered most. How much did this cost in materials and labor? Ephraim provided numbers. The fence framework required 20 posts and split rails, approximately 5 days of work. The hay represented 2 acres of growing space and 3 weeks of cutting and drying, plus trades for additional bales. Total investment was perhaps 40 days of labor and the opportunity cost of 2 acres that could have grown cash crops. Against this, he was saving approximately 3 cords of firewood per winter, which represented substantial labor in cutting and hauling. The payback period was essentially immediate. Matthias thanked Ephraim for the explanation and left without further comment. But Ephraim noticed something in Matthias's expression as he departed. The mockery was gone, replaced by thoughtful consideration. Late January 1858 brought weather that would be remembered across the territory for decades. An Arctic front descended from Canada and settled over the northern plains with brutal intensity. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero on January 23rd and continued falling. By January 25th, the thermometer at the settlement read 30 below. On January 27th, it reached 35 below zero, and there it remained for 4 consecutive days. This was cold that exceeded anything the settlers had experienced. Cold that froze spit before it hit the ground. Cold that turned exposed skin white with frostbite in minutes. Cold that killed livestock in their barns despite shelter and hay bedding. Cold that made breathing painful and dangerous as frozen air seared lungs. The settlement essentially ceased functioning. No one traveled between cabins. No one ventured outside except for the minimum time required to care for animals or carry firewood from pile to house. Inside the cabins, families fought for survival. Fireplaces roared constantly, consuming wood at rates that drained reserves with terrifying speed. Men burned furniture when firewood ran low. They burned fence rails, tool handles, anything combustible. Despite these desperate measures, interior temperatures in most cabins remained barely above freezing. Water froze solid in buckets placed 6 feet from roaring fires. Families slept in their clothes under every blanket they owned, huddled together for shared body heat, and still woke with frost on their hair. Gustav Reinhardt's cabin was among the hardest hit. The Reinhardt family consisted of Gustav, his wife Helena, and their 4 children ranging in age from 3 to 12 years. Their cabin was well built by standard measures, but it faced the same fundamental problem every log cabin faced. It could not hold heat. By the 3rd day of 35 below temperatures, Gustav had burned through his entire firewood reserve and started on the emergency supply he had intended to save for late winter. His children were showing signs of cold exposure, despite being indoors constantly. The youngest, a 3-year-old boy named Wilhelm, had developed a persistent cough and seemed lethargic. Helena begged Gustav to seek help, but help from where? Every family faced identical conditions. No one had surplus resources to share. The settlement doctor Pierce was trapped in his own cabin 3 miles away, unable to travel in such cold. Gustav continued burning wood, continued trying to maintain warmth, but the mathematics were working against him. He was consuming wood faster than the cabin could retain heat. Each log burned produced a temporary spike in warmth that dissipated within an hour. The cabin was a furnace that consumed fuel without effectively heating the space. On the 4th day of extreme cold, Wilhelm's condition worsened noticeably. His skin took on a bluish tint. His breathing became shallow. His body temperature dropped despite being wrapped in blankets and held close to the fire. Helena recognized the signs of severe hypothermia. Her son was freezing to death inside their cabin while a fire blazed less than 10 feet away. Helena Reinhardt made a decision that overrode her husband's pride. On the morning of January 31st, with temperatures still locked at 35 below zero and Wilhelm barely responsive despite being wrapped in every available blanket, she told Gustav that they were taking their son to the Kolstad cabin. Gustav initially refused. He would not beg help from the man he had publicly mocked. He would not admit that Ephraim's absurd hay fortress was their only hope. Helena did not argue. She simply wrapped Wilhelm in blankets, bundled the other 3 children in every piece of clothing they owned, and walked to the door. Gustav understood he had no choice. His son was dying. Pride was irrelevant. He helped Helena prepare the children, then stepped outside into cold so intense it felt like a physical assault. The Kolstad cabin was half a mile away. In normal weather, an easy walk. In 35 below temperatures, the distance was potentially fatal. They would have to move quickly. The family stumbled through snowdrifts, Gustav carrying Wilhelm, Helena leading the 3 older children. The cold penetrated their clothing within seconds. Exposed skin on their faces went numb almost immediately. Breathing became painful as frozen air filled their lungs. The children began crying from cold and fear. Gustav pushed forward, knowing they had perhaps 10 minutes before the cold would incapacitate them completely. Ephraim heard pounding on his door and opened it to find the Reinhardt family in desperate condition. He pulled them inside immediately, not asking questions, simply getting them out of the lethal cold. The temperature differential was so extreme that the family stood in stunned silence for several moments, their bodies struggling to process the sudden change from 35 below to 60 above, a 95-degree shift in seconds. Wilhelm was unconscious in Gustav's arms. Ephraim took the boy and laid him near the fireplace on blankets. Ingrid began removing the frozen outer layers of clothing, while Helena knelt beside her son, rubbing his hands and feet to restore circulation. The other Reinhardt children stood near the fire, shaking violently as their bodies warmed. Gustav remained by the door, his face expressing emotions too complex to name. Shame, gratitude, disbelief, and relief mixed together. Within 20 minutes, Wilhelm began responding. His eyes opened, his breathing deepened. Color returned to his skin as his core temperature stabilized. Helena wept openly, holding her son and thanking God and Ingrid and Ephraim in a continuous stream of words. The older children stopped shivering and began removing their heavy coats, amazed at the warmth surrounding them. Gustav finally moved away from the door and approached Ephraim. The two men looked at each other for a long moment. Then Gustav spoke quietly, his voice stripped of all the confidence and judgment that usually characterized his speech. "I was wrong about your hay fortress. It is not foolishness. It is the only thing between my family and freezing to death." Ephraim nodded once, accepting the apology without gloating. "Your family can stay here until the cold breaks." The Reinhardt family remained in Ephraim's cabin for 3 days while the extreme cold persisted. 8 people occupied the space designed for 4, but the hay fortress provided enough warmth that crowding was the only discomfort. Wilhelm recovered fully, his color returning and his energy restored as his body warmed to normal temperature. The other Reinhardt children adapted to the situation with the resilience of youth, treating the experience as an adventure rather than a crisis. Gustav spent those 3 days observing everything about the cabin. He studied the hay walls from inside, noting how the interior logs remained warm to the touch instead of radiating cold. He watched Ephraim maintain the fire, noticing how little wood was required to keep the space comfortable. He asked detailed questions about construction methods, material costs, and whether the hay had remained dry through the winter months. Ephraim answered each question thoroughly, sharing information without reservation. On the second evening, while the children slept and the women talked quietly near the fireplace, Gustav and Ephraim sat at the table discussing the physics of heat retention. Gustav was not an educated man, but he understood practical mechanics. Ephraim explained how hollow air spaces prevented heat transfer, how the hay created a buffer zone that trapped warmth, and why 3 feet of insulation made such a dramatic difference compared to bare logs. Gustav listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The external temperature finally moderated on February 2nd, climbing to 10 below zero. Still dangerously cold, but survivable for the short walk back to the Reinhardt cabin. Gustav prepared his family to leave, bundling the children carefully and thanking Ingrid for her hospitality. Helena embraced Ingrid with genuine emotion, telling her that she had saved Wilhelm's life and would never forget the kindness. The Reinhardt family departed at midday, moving quickly through the cold toward their own cabin. That evening, Gustav returned alone. He knocked on Ephraim's door and asked if they could talk. Ephraim invited him inside. Gustav got directly to the point. He wanted to build a hay fortress around his own cabin before next winter. He needed to know exact specifications for the fence framework, the spacing from cabin walls, the amount of hay required, and the construction sequence. He also wanted to apologize publicly for the mockery he had directed at Ephraim during the fall. Ephraim told Gustav the apology was unnecessary. People often mocked what they did not understand. That was human nature. What mattered was that Gustav now understood the value of proper insulation and wanted to protect his family. Ephraim spent an hour providing detailed construction information, even offering to help build Gustav's framework in the spring. Gustav accepted the offer, shook Ephraim's hand with genuine respect, and walked back into the cold night. Word spread quickly through the settlement. Within a week, 3 more families had visited Ephraim asking about hay insulation. Matthias came, as did Otto Lindgren and Henrik Thatcher. Each man had survived the extreme cold, but recognized how close they had come to disaster. Each wanted to avoid repeating the experience next winter. Spring 1858 arrived with the settlement fundamentally changed. The extreme cold of late January had killed 4 people in the surrounding territory, elderly individuals and 1 young child who froze in cabins that could not maintain adequate warmth. The survivors understood that winter in Dakota Territory was not merely uncomfortable, but actively lethal if proper preparations were not made. Ephraim's hay fortress, which had seemed absurd in October, now represented proven life-saving technology. Gustav began construction on his own hay fortress in early May, immediately after spring planting. Ephraim helped him mark the perimeter and dig post holes, sharing techniques he had learned through his own experience. Gustav's framework took 3 weeks to complete with 2 men working together. Other settlers stopped by to observe the construction and ask questions. Matthias decided to build his own version. Then Otto, then Henrik, then 3 more families. By June, 7 cabins in the settlement had frameworks under construction. The building methods varied slightly based on available materials and individual preferences, but the core principle remained consistent. Posts driven into the ground 3 feet from cabin walls, horizontal rails creating a framework, space reserved for hay bales that would be installed after fall harvest. The settlement was adopting Ephraim's innovation wholesale. Not everyone participated. Some families lacked the labor or resources to undertake such extensive construction. Others remained skeptical despite the evidence, preferring to trust traditional methods and hope for milder winters. But the majority recognized practical wisdom when they saw it demonstrated. The hay fortress worked. People who had built them stayed warm while burning less firewood. The mathematics were undeniable. Ephraim found himself in an unexpected role as technical advisor. Men came to his cabin asking about post spacing, rail heights, and hay bale arrangements. Women asked Ingrid about managing moisture inside well-insulated cabins and whether additional ventilation was necessary. Ephraim answered every question patiently, emphasizing that he had not invented anything revolutionary. He had simply applied common sense and observation to solve a specific problem. Any man could do the same. The term Kolstad method appeared in conversation that summer, though Ephraim never used it himself. He simply called it hay insulation, a practical technique that improved winter survival. But names stick, regardless of their originator's preferences, and throughout the settlement and gradually spreading to neighboring communities, the practice of building hay-insulated cabins became associated with Ephraim's name. By October 1858, 12 cabins stood enclosed in hay fortresses. The visual impact was remarkable. The settlement's appearance had transformed from scattered log cabins to a collection of hay-wrapped structures that looked more like agricultural buildings than homes. Visitors from other settlements found the sight bizarre until they heard the explanation. Then they began asking questions about construction details and winter performance. The winter of 1858 to 59 would provide the ultimate validation of widespread adoption. Winter 1858 to 59 was milder than the previous year, but still harsh by any reasonable measure. Temperatures regularly dropped below 0. Several storms dumped heavy snow. January brought 2 weeks of sustained cold in the -10 to -20 range. Conditions were severe enough to test every structure and every family's preparations. The hay-insulated cabins performed exactly as expected. Families living in them maintained comfortable interior temperatures while consuming firewood at rates 50 to 60% lower than previous winters. Children played indoors without needing heavy clothing. Women worked at tasks that had been impossible in frigid cabins. Men found they could reduce wood-cutting labor significantly, freeing time for other winter activities like equipment maintenance and repair work. The contrast with non-insulated cabins was obvious to everyone. Families who had not adopted the hay fortress approach struggled through another brutal winter, burning wood constantly and still living in conditions that were barely tolerable. Several families who had been skeptical the previous spring began planning their own hay insulation projects for the following year. The technique spread beyond the immediate settlement. Travelers and traders carried descriptions of the hay fortresses to other communities across the territory. Some people adopted the method immediately. Others experimented with variations, trying different insulation materials or alternative framework designs. But the core concept of creating a thick insulation barrier around cabins to trap heat became widely recognized as practical wisdom worth implementing. Documentation of the spread is fragmentary, but references appear in letters, journals, and occasional newspaper articles from the period. A letter written in January 1859 by a settler near Fort Pierre mentions seeing cabins wrapped in hay for warmth, a technique said to have originated near the Creek settlements. A trader's journal from 1860 describes the Kolstad method of hay insulation, now common throughout the Northern Territories. Ephraim himself never promoted the technique beyond answering questions from those who asked. He continued farming, raising his family, and living quietly. His cabin remained wrapped in hay each winter, the golden walls rebuilt each October, and removed each April when the hay was distributed to livestock as spring feed. The cycle became routine, no longer remarkable. By 1860, hay-insulated cabins were common enough in Dakota Territory that they stopped being noteworthy. New settlers arriving from the east were sometimes surprised to see cabins wrapped in hay. But established residents explained the reasoning, and the newcomers typically adopted the practice for their own structures. The innovation had become standard practice, incorporated into the collective knowledge of how to survive winters on the northern plains. Ephraim's contribution faded into the background of ordinary life. He was respected in his community, but not celebrated. He had solved a problem, shared the solution, and moved on. That was the frontier way. Good ideas spread through demonstration and practical success, not through promotion or credit-seeking. Ephraim Kolstad died in March 1879 at the age of 55. He collapsed while working in his barn, his heart simply stopping without warning. Ingrid found him an hour later. The funeral was well attended, with families coming from across the region to pay respects to a man they had known for more than 2 decades. He was buried in the settlement cemetery on the hill above the creek, his grave marked with a simple stone bearing his name and dates. His cabin, still standing with its hay fortress rebuilt each autumn, was occupied by his son Lars and Lars's family. The structure remained solid, the framework Ephraim had built in 1857 still functional after 22 years. Lars continued the practice of wrapping the cabin in hay each winter, maintaining the technique his father had developed. When Lars eventually built a larger house in 1885, he incorporated the hay insulation concept into the new construction, building double walls with the space between filled with hay. The technique persisted across the Northern Territories well into the 1890s, even as improved building methods and materials became available. Some families maintained hay insulation for decades, valuing the proven performance over newer approaches. Others gradually transitioned to manufactured insulation materials as they became affordable, but the principle remained the same. Trapping air in small spaces to prevent heat transfer was sound physics, whether accomplished with hay or factory-produced materials. Modern historians studying frontier settlement patterns occasionally encounter references to hay-insulated cabins in documents from the period. The practice is usually mentioned in passing, as one of many adaptations settlers made to survive harsh conditions. The specific attribution to Ephraim Kolstad appears rarely, and only in documents from the immediate region where he lived. To the broader historical record, hay insulation was simply one technique among many, its origins unclear, and ultimately unimportant. The cabin Ephraim built in 1856 stood until 1923, when it was finally torn down to make way for a modern farmhouse. The hay fortress had long since been abandoned in favor of conventional construction with manufactured insulation. But the logs from Ephraim's cabin, still solid after 67 years, were salvaged and used to build a large barn that stood for another 40 years. What Ephraim accomplished was not revolutionary in the dramatic sense. He did not invent new materials or discover unknown principles. He simply observed a problem, studied solutions that nature and tradition suggested, and applied practical intelligence to create something that worked better than existing methods. The innovation was humble, built from hay and fence posts rather than exotic materials. But it solved a real problem that killed real people. The story teaches that frontier innovation often came from necessity rather than inspiration, from grief and determination rather than genius. Ephraim watched a neighbor freeze to death and decided his own family would not face that fate. He built something that looked absurd but functioned brilliantly, and when others needed the same solution, he shared it freely.